The sea churned like boiling lead beneath a sky of unbroken slate. On the cliffs above Seabridge, Cliffside Manor stood defiant against the winter gloom of 1830. Its gables pierced the low clouds like blackened bones. The town knew its whispered history of sudden fevers and shattered minds, a ghost they preferred to ignore when a new future arrived in a fine black lacquered carriage. Mrs. Seraphina Winterbourne descended with the poised grace of a visiting dignitary. Her mourning dress was of the finest silk, a stark contrast to the drab woolens of the gathered fishermen. She addressed them not as a stranger, but as a benefactor. Her cultured voice carried the promise of the Ashenwood Academy, a sanctuary for the education of young women with nowhere else to turn. It was a noble purpose, a beacon of virtue and refinement. The promise of renewal was a powerful lure. The community, weary from past scandals and economic hardship, chose to focus on the prospect of coin and custom. Desperation proved stronger than superstition. The transaction with the town's solicitor was brief. Mrs. Winterbourne's offer for the property was more than generous. With the scratch of a pen, the deed was transferred. She assured the official that the academy would restore honor to the cliffs. Her words were smooth and final. Renovations began with a fury of activity. The sounds of hammers and saws echoed through hollow rooms. Workmen labored under Mrs. Winterbourne's exacting direction. Her presence was constant. The primary focus was the third floor, where she insisted on constructing small, private chambers called meditation rooms. Their specifications were unusual, with heavily soundproofed walls and sparse, austere furnishings. Simultaneously, crews reinforced the estate's isolation, repairing the perimeter wall and adding formidable iron spikes. The heavy sea-facing gate was strengthened with new iron bands. Each change felt less like an improvement and more like a fortification. The men worked in a hushed atmosphere. This was especially true when they made strange discoveries within the walls. One man pulled a bundle of small, brittle bones from behind the lath. Another found rusted fishhooks wrapped in faded, embroidered cloth. They showed these items to the widow, their faces etched with unease. Mrs. Winterbourne examined each object with clinical detachment. She offered no explanation. Instead, she paid each man a generous bonus, her quiet words stressing the importance of discretion. The extra coin was a bribe wrapped in the language of propriety. One local, a fisherman named Elias, proved resistant to this new economy of silence. He voiced his suspicions loudly at the tavern, asking pointed questions about the strange renovations. Then Elias failed to return from the sea. His boat was found days later, adrift and perfectly intact. The town magistrate, eager to avoid complication, declared it a tragic accident. But a new, grim understanding settled over Seabridge. The workmen returned to their labors with renewed focus. Inquiry was a dangerous luxury. The first students arrived on a day that felt more like a funeral procession than a new beginning. A small cluster of young women huddled against the biting wind. Their faces were pale, their postures timid. Each had been selected with chilling precision: orphans, wards of the state, girls from families too distant or indifferent to notice their absence. Mrs. Winterbourne greeted them on the stone steps. Her smile was a flawless performance of welcome. She spoke of sanctuary and refinement, her voice a smooth contrast to the thunderous crash of waves below. She promised them a future of accomplishment. She led them through the heavy oak doors into the cavernous entrance hall. The air inside was still and frigid, carrying the scent of damp stone and old beeswax. A grand staircase swept upwards into shadowy gloom. Their footsteps echoed on the polished floor, quickly swallowed by the oppressive silence. Winterbourne gestured gracefully to the fine paneling, but the girl's eyes were drawn to the heavy velvet drapes and the many firmly shut doors. The tour felt like a journey through a museum of forgotten grandeur. A drawing room held chairs arranged with sterile precision. A library's shelves stood nearly empty. Every space was correct, yet utterly lifeless. Winterbourne's commentary remained bright and encouraging, but her words could not penetrate the pervasive chill. One young woman, Verity, watched everything with a quiet intensity. She noted how the light from the sea-facing windows struggled to illuminate the interior, casting long, distorted shadows. The grandeur felt like a beautifully crafted cage, a stark contrast to the promised freedom. As evening bled into night, the feeble light vanished completely. The tour concluded back in the main hall. Mrs. Winterbourne offered a few final, hollow assurances. Then she excused herself, her black silk dress disappearing into the deep shadows of a corridor. A silent attendant moved to the great doors. The heavy thud of the oak bar sliding into its brackets was a definitive sound. Outside, the wind began to keen. The first drops of rain lashed against the windows like thrown gravel. The storm gathered its strength over the churning sea, sealing the new arrivals inside their gilded prison. The promise of sanctuary had evaporated, replaced by the stark reality of the bolt on the door. The thin grey light of a winter afternoon stretched across Seabridge Harbour. From her workshop window, Elara Threadwell watched the day fade. Her hands maintained their rhythm, a needle pulling silk through dark wool, but her focus belonged entirely to Cliffside Manor across the bay. The Ashenwood Academy stood stark against the leaden sky, its windows like shuttered eyes. She knew its public rhythms by heart. Students walked the frost-lined paths in quiet pairs. Lamplight bloomed in orderly succession at dusk. Elara's vantage point was a secret ledger, and she recorded these mundane entries without thought. Then came the deviation. A lacquered carriage moved without sound along the coastal road. It bypassed the main gate, turning into a narrow lane almost invisible from the town and disappearing into a grove of skeletal trees. This was wealth-seeking discretion. Minutes later, a change occurred. Windows on the third floor, usually dark voids, glowed to life. The lamplight was brighter, more urgent, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to twitch. A profound stillness settled over the building afterward. Figures outside hurried indoors. The very air seemed to grow heavy with a silent dread that seeped from the stone walls. It was a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter wind. She set her sewing aside. Her methodical nature, usually applied to the geometry of a cuff, now turned toward this unsettling equation. A wealthy carriage, a hidden entrance, an ominous light. She reached for a small journal hidden in a drawer. Her pencil began to write. The date, the time, a description of the carriage. It was not curiosity that moved her, but a slow burning sense of justice. The documentation had begun. Weeks slipped by, marked by the grim pattern Elara now tracked. Her journal filled with precise script. It became a calendar of dread. The carriages always arrived after full dark, their lanterns shuttered. Some bore a distinct crest, a stylized bird with a broken wing. Others were unmarked, their plainness itself a declaration. The mornings after these visits brought a predictable shift. Silas, the Academy's imposing enforcer, patrolled the grounds with a new intensity. His large frame moved with a quiet menace. Then came the morning she witnessed the human cost. The fragile student, Lily Melody, was being escorted across the courtyard by Dr. Graves. Elara remembered Lily from her arrival, a slight figure who had carried her music case with a hopeful step. The girl who now shuffled across the stones was a ghost of that person. Her posture was slumped, her gait unsteady. Dr. Graves's hand on her arm was not supportive. It was directive, possessive. The connection solidified with a cold certainty. The carriages, the secret meetings, and this visible deterioration were threads of the same dark pattern. Her investigation was no longer abstract. It had a face, and the face was Lily's. The inquiry escalated personally days later. Down at the docks mending a sail, a fisherman named Elias approached. He worked the waters that supplied the academy. He stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His voice was low. He mentioned the fine, clear view from her workshop window. Then he advised that some things were better left unobserved for a person's own health. It was not a friendly warning. It was a threat from a man loyal to the Academy's deep-pocketed patrons. He walked away, leaving Elara with the cold taste of fear. Her vigil had been noticed. The turning point arrived on a night when the wind screamed like a banshee off the sea. Rain lashed Elara's workshop in horizontal sheets. She fought to secure the shuddering shutters. Through a rattling pane, she saw a dark carriage laboring up the muddy cliffside road. As it neared the Academy's gate, a violent gust shook the vehicle. Something small and metallic flew from its side, landing in the churned mud near the gatepost. The carriage, unaware, pressed on and disappeared. The storm swallowed the sound of its arrival. Elara waited. The tempest raged for hours before subsiding into a bruised, pre-dawn calm. She ventured out into the soaked world and made her way to the Academy's boundary. There, half submerged in the mire, was the object. She knelt and pried it loose. It was a crest, no larger than a locket, wrought in tarnished silver. The design was a stylized bird of prey clutching a skeletal key. She wiped the mud away. She had seen this emblem before, stamped on the wax seals of letters delivered to Mrs. Winterbourne by a particular courier. This was proof, a tangible piece of the mystery. The metal felt unnaturally cold in her palm. She stood at a precipice, the crest a weight in her hand. She could hide it, bury this dangerous knowledge, and feign ignorance for her own safety. Or she could risk everything. She could take this evidence and seek an ally within those oppressive walls. The choice was stark. The silence after the storm felt more threatening than the gale itself. The weak January light struggled through the tall, grimy windows of Ashenwood's great hall. Dust motes drifted like tiny ghosts in the frigid air. A deep cold had settled into the stone walls, resisting the meager heat from the hearths. The students moved through their lessons with a profound weariness, their faces pale and marked by a distant stare. Verity Constance sat among them, her posture carefully curved to mimic their exhausted slump. But her sharp gray eyes missed nothing. She noted the tremor in a hand that once held a needle steady. She saw the bruise, the color of a stormy twilight, peeking from beneath a high collar. She watched Lily Melody most of all. The girl who had filled the music room with life now flinched at the sound of a dropped book. Her hands shook too violently to hold a piece of chalk. Dr. Ephraim Graves moved through the rows with a detached, clinical air. He paused by a student who seemed faint, his fingers pressing against a wrist as if checking a clock's mechanism. He murmured about winter agues and the necessity of strong constitutions. His explanations were calm and utterly dismissive of the suffering before him. Reverend Absalom Clemency followed, a darker shadow. Where the doctor spoke of bodily weakness, the Reverend diagnosed a failure of spirit. He described the pervasive lethargy as a moral laxity, a sin demanding correction. His gaze saw not illness but divine displeasure. Together, the two men created a perfect gauge of explanation. Any affliction was either a natural flaw or a spiritual judgment. Verity watched it all, her face a placid mask. Inside, a quiet revolution was taking place. The reasonable words from the staff no longer settled her mind. They grated against the raw evidence of her peers' decline. The gap between spoken reassurances and witnessed reality had become a chasm. On the far side lay a terrifying truth, one that hardened her fear into something colder and more determined. Darkness owned the dormitory long after the final candle was snuffed. Only faint moonlight outlined the rows of narrow cots. The air hung heavy with the scent of cold linen and the pervasive tang of the sea. Verity lay perfectly still, her breathing even. Every sense was attuned to the room's secret life. From the cot beside her, Lily's breaths were shallow, rattling things. It was a sound more dreadful than silence. A hiss came from a few beds away. Clara, a girl with anxious eyes, broke the quiet. "She was herself," Clara whispered. "Just days ago." She murmured fragments of fear about the recent gathering behind the third-floor doors and how Lily had returned a ghost. Another whisper joined from the opposite side. It spoke of a pattern, a dreadful rhythm they all recognized. Each secret assembly was followed by a visible decline in one of the charity students. The hushed words wove a tapestry of shared dread, confirming the terrible suspicion Verity had held for months. A long, mournful creak sounded from a floorboard near the door. The whispers died instantly. Every girl held her breath, bodies rigid in feigned sleep. The sound was not followed by another. It was just the old house complaining, or perhaps the wind. But the interruption had done its work. Paranoia was now a physical presence, crouching in the shadows. Just as the silence threatened to break again, a different sound froze them all. The distinct, heavy click of the latch turning. The dormitory door swung open without a sound. A tall, dark shape filled the doorway, the silhouette of a matron stark against the dim hall. The room became a tomb. The only sound was the matron's slow, deliberate footsteps on the wood. She paced the length of the room, her presence a cold wave washing over the pretended slumber. She paused for a long moment near Lily's bed, a shadow looking down on a smaller shadow. Then she continued, the door clicking shut behind her. The silence she left behind was thicker, more potent with fear. No one dared whisper again. But in that shared, breathless terror, a new understanding had solidified. They were all witnesses to a quiet atrocity. Later, standing near the chapel doors after morning prayers, Verity traced the cold wood grain with her fingers. A ripple of unease passed through the students filing out. There, slumped against the wall, was Lily Melody. Lily did not move. Her eyes were open but vacant, fixed on some horror only she could see. Her body was rigid, a statue seized by a private cataclysm. Verity's throat tightened. This was beyond listlessness. This was an erasure. Before anyone could react, Dr. Graves appeared. His steps were brisk. He barely glanced at Lily's frozen form. "A common fainting spell," he declared, shooing the other students away with an impatient gesture. His assistants moved with practiced efficiency, lifting Lily's rigid body onto a stretcher as if she were a sack of grain. They carried her away down the corridor. Verity watched the performance, a cold certainty settling in her bones. That was not a swoon. It was a lie, delivered with chilling casualness. The blatant cover-up acted as a catalyst. Her resolve, once a secret seed, now put down deep roots. Under the pretense of fetching fresh linens, Verity slipped into the infirmary hours later. The room smelled of lye soap and something faintly metallic. Lily lay on a cot, still and silent as stone. There was no sign of the doctor or his remedies. As Verity approached the bedside, her foot struck a small, metallic object. It skittered across the floorboards with a faint chime. She knelt and picked it up. It was a locket, simple and silver. It must have fallen from Lily's neck. The metal was unnaturally cold, a deep chill that seeped into Verity's palm. It felt far heavier than its size suggested, as if weighted with a secret. She turned it over in her fingers. The surface was smooth, devoid of any inscription. This small, cold weight in her hand was a tangible piece of the mystery. It was a fragment of Lily's silent story. The public lie had been an outrage, but this locket was a direct summons. Verity's role was no longer to simply observe and endure. She had been handed a thread, and she would now pull. She closed her fingers tightly around the metal, its cold a promise and a threat. The time for watching was over. Julian Freeman faced the classroom of young women for his first lesson. Late winter light seeped through the tall leaded windows, casting a dull gray pallor over the rows of desks. He had prepared a lecture on civic virtue, hoping to inspire discussion. He posed a simple question about the nature of justice. His words seemed to dissolve into the heavy, suffocating silence. He scanned the faces before him, meeting only vacant stares or eyes that quickly fell to the scratched wooden desktops. The air felt thick and difficult to breathe. His attention settled on Verity Constance, one of the charity pupils. He had been told these women were here for intellectual and moral empowerment. Yet, in Verity's eyes, he saw not curiosity, but a deep, watchful fear. Her posture was one of perfect, unnerving stillness. He tried again, rephrasing his question with deliberate warmth. But girl near the back flinched at the sound of his voice. Julian noted the subtle signs of their collective decline. Their skin had a waxen pallor. Shadows pooled beneath their eyes, and their simple dresses hung a little too loosely. This was not the robust health promised in the Academy's literature. This was a slow, systematic wasting. The noble mission statement recited by Mrs. Winterbourne felt like a bitter mockery. His own idealism curdled into a cold, dawning horror. The silence was not mere shyness. It was a lesson they had learned well. It was the silence of fear. After the lesson, Julian waited on a hard-backed chair outside Mrs. Winterbourne's office. The air smelled of beeswax and dried lavender, a deceptively tranquil scent. He rehearsed his questions quietly, acutely aware he navigated a precipice. He was admitted into the opulent room. Dark wood panels and heavy crimson drapes created a sense of enveloping gloom. Mrs. Winterbourne sat behind a vast mahogany desk, her posture impeccably composed. He began by complimenting the Academy's stated mission before carefully mentioning the students' unusual quietness. He phrased it as a concern for their academic engagement. Mrs. Winterbourne listened with a placid smile. She folded her elegant hands on the polished wood. She acknowledged his observation with a slight nod, then reframed it entirely. She suggested the students' passivity was not a flaw, but the desired outcome of their moral conditioning. True virtue, she explained, required the silencing of a restless spirit. Julian felt a profound chill at her interpretation. He pressed gently, inquiring about the methods used. He specifically referenced the special conditioning mentioned in the prospectus. Her smile did not waver, but her eyes grew cold and distant. She warned him against an overzealous focus on methodology. His role was to impart knowledge, not to question the Academy's foundational philosophy. The polite words carried a clear and unmistakable threat. Julian understood then that direct confrontation was impossible. He offered a courteous nod and excused himself, the weight of his discovery settling heavily upon him. Later, Julian found Reverend Clemency standing alone in the drafty dormitory hallway. The only light came from a single guttering lamp, casting long, wavering shadows. The sound of the wind outside was a constant, mournful wail. Julian approached, his footsteps silent on the worn runner. He remarked that the students seemed profoundly subdued after their spiritual guidance. The Reverend turned, his face a mask of serene conviction. He replied that the world often mistook noisy pride for true vitality. He called the student's state a blessed stillness, a victory over youthful vanity. His words were smooth and practiced, a well-rehearsed sermon. To Julian, the explanation felt hollow, a brittle shell hiding something rotten. He saw a profound emptiness in the eyes of the young women who passed them, a lethargy that felt less like piety and more like defeat. Julian suggested that humility should not extinguish the light of inquiry. Clemency's smile was thin and cold. He stated that inquiry without doctrine was a flame without a hearth, dangerous and destructive. His tone carried a finality that brooked no argument, a subtle threat veiled in spiritual authority. Julian saw the institution's ethos for what it was, a cage of words designed to keep the vulnerable compliant. A door creaked open further down the hall. Julian saw Lily Melody stumble from the third-floor door. Her movements were unsteady, a marionette with its strings cut. He waited a moment before following at a discreet distance. She did not go far. He found her curled on a window seat in an empty corridor. Her face was pressed against the cold glass, her shoulders trembling. The sea churned gray and white far below. Julian approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. He spoke her name softly. Lily flinched, turning a face drained of all color toward him. Her eyes were wide with a terror too profound for words. She opened her mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. Her hands clutched at the fabric of her dress, knuckles white. Julian knew then that whatever happened in those chambers was not meditation. It was intentional harm. Later, the students were taken for a supervised walk along the cliff path. The wind whipped at their coats and tore at their hair. An enforcer, a large man named Silas, watched their every step. Julian maneuvered until he walked beside Verity Constance. He spoke quietly of the biting wind, a meaningless pleasantry. Under its cover, he murmured a question about Lily's condition. Verity kept her eyes fixed ahead on the treacherous path. Her voice was barely a whisper. Snatched by the gale, she said the chambers were not for meditation. Silas's heavy gaze fell upon them. Verity immediately fell silent, increasing her pace to put distance between them. That single, whispered confirmation solidified everything. It was not mere suspicion anymore. Julian retreated to his small, cold quarters. His idealism lay shattered around him. He saw clearly that openly challenging Mrs. Winterbourne was futile. He resolved to feign compliance while secretly gathering evidence. It was a dangerous decision that marked his transition from a naive teacher to a determined investigator. At the evening meal, he noticed a flicker of recognition in Verity's eye as she passed his table. It was a silent, unspoken acknowledgement that she perceived his shift in allegiance. It was a fragile spark of hope amidst the overwhelming dread. The library was a cavern of shadows that night, its vastness swallowing the feeble light from the high windows. A relentless march. Rain drummed against the panes, a constant hiss that deepened the silence within. Julian Freeman sought refuge among the towering bookshelves after evening prayers. He stood before the great fireplace, its meager heat doing little to banish the damp chill that clung to the air. The firelight cast long, wavering shapes across the leather-bound volumes, making the bookshelves seem like rows of silent, judging sentinels. His thoughts churned, a private tempest to match the one raging outside the manor walls. It was then he heard it, a soft scuff of a shoe on the old floorboards. The sound did not come from the dormitory wing. It originated from the darkened mouth of a corridor strictly forbidden to all but the Academy's leadership. Julian turned slowly, his every sense suddenly sharpened. A figure emerged from the gloom, hesitant yet purposeful. It was Verity Constance. Her presence here, at this hour, was a transgression of the highest order. But it was her expression that truly arrested him. The carefully cultivated docility she showed the world was entirely absent. In its place was a sharp, calculating awareness. Her eyes, far from being downcast, met his with an unnerving directness. She was not a frightened girl, caught somewhere she shouldn't be. She was a woman engaged in a private, perilous assessment. The shock of the encounter held them both in a suspended silence. Only the rain's insistent rhythm filled the space between them. Julian watched the rapid calculation in her gaze, the visible weighing of risk and opportunity. He had ventured into the shadows expecting to find a victim. He had found an equal. She broke the tense quiet with a hushed, pointed question. "You see it too, don't you?" The rot beneath the veneer. In that moment, the entire nature of his investigation shifted. The corruption was not merely something inflicted upon the students. It was being actively witnessed and documented from within. Verity Constance was not just surviving the Academy's grip, she was resisting it. He moved closer, his own footsteps muffled by a thick, worn rug. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and cold stone. He asked her what business a student could possibly have in a restricted corridor adjacent to the library. The question was a delicate probe, a test of the dangerous ground they now shared. Verity did not answer immediately. Her eyes searched his face with an intensity that felt stripping, looking past his role as an instructor and seeking the man beneath. The tension was a palpable force in the cramped space between the shelves. Finally, her posture softened by a fraction, a decision made. She confessed that her compliance was a performance, maintained for months as a shield. Behind it, she had been observing, documenting the slow unraveling of her fellow students and the cold machinations of the staff. To give weight to her words, she reached into a hidden pocket within the folds of her simple woolen dress. Her movements were furtive, her gaze darting toward the library's entrance to ensure they remained alone. She produced a small, cloth-bound notebook, its cover worn soft from secret handling. She pressed it into his hands. Julian accepted the object with a sense of grim ceremony. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with a dense, meticulous script, a personal code of abbreviations and symbols he could not immediately decipher. Interspersed were dates, names, and chillingly clinical notes on student ailments and staff movements. This was not a diary, it was a ledger of evidence. The physicality of the notebook transformed everything. The dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. He was no longer a teacher confronting a wayward student. She was no longer a suspect hiding in the shadows. They were allies, standing on the same treacherous ground, bound by a shared and dangerous secret. He turned the pages with careful reverence. Verity's notes laid bare a systematic pattern of decay. She had catalogued the nocturnal arrivals of unmarked carriages, the coinciding disappearances of students like Lily Melody, and the hollow official explanations that followed. Julian compared these entries with his own observations. The students' listless eyes, the physician's dismissive diagnoses. isolated pieces of a horrifying puzzle snapped together. The conspiracy was far more extensive and deliberate than he had imagined. A silent understanding solidified between them. They had been two lonely observers, each gathering threads in the dark. Now they saw the necessity of weaving those threads together. Their separate vulnerabilities, when combined, created a fragile shield. Julian finally gave voice to the new reality. His words barely a whisper. He stated the simple, undeniable truth that neither of them could confront this alone. Verity responded with a single, resolved nod. The pact was sealed without further ceremony. They devised a simple, cautious plan. The library, with its labyrinthine shelves and infrequent foot traffic, would serve as their conduit. A specific gap behind a large folio of maritime charts on a high, dusty shelf was chosen as a dead drop. Notes would be left there, discoveries shared, all under the thin guise of solitary study. Julian slid the notebook back to its owner. The act felt like crossing a threshold from which there was no return. As they prepared to part ways, a floorboard creaked somewhere deep within the manor's old bones. The sound, once ordinary, now seemed a deliberate warning. The familiar groans and sighs of the house were transformed. Every noise was a potential threat, every shadow a possible witness. They slicked away in opposite directions, the weight of their shared secret, a new and palpable burden. The ordinary world of the academy had vanished, replaced by a landscape of constant, silent peril. The fog clung to the window panes of the administrative office, a gray shroud that muted the pre-dawn light. Julian Freeman turned the key in the lock. The click echoed sharply in the oppressive silence. He motioned for Verity Constance to enter first. Shh. He slipped past him, a shadow in her dark dress. Her attention immediately scanned the room for any sign of disturbance. The air was heavy with the smell of old paper and sealing wax. Julian closed the door softly behind them. The sound of his own breathing seemed suddenly too loud. Verity moved to the window. Her posture was rigid as she watched the empty courtyard. She confirmed the coast was clear with a tight nod. Her role as lookout was vital. Silas and his men were known for their unpredictable rounds. Julian's gaze fell upon the heavy oak cabinet against the far wall. Its dark wood seemed to absorb what little light penetrated the gloom. He crossed the room, his footsteps muffled by a worn rug. From his waistcoat, he produced a set of slender tools. His hands, usually steady for teaching, trembled slightly as he selected a pick. The lock was a formidable one, brass and intricate. He worked with a focused intensity, every sense heightened. The scrape of metal on metal was a tiny, violent sound in the stillness. He could feel Verity's nervous energy from across the room. It was a silent pressure urging him to hurry. Each second stretched into an eternity. It was filled with the imagined echo of boot heels on the marble hallway outside. Then came a soft, decisive click. Julian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He carefully opened the cabinet door. Its hinges groaned a low protest. Inside, stacked in neat, daunting rows, were the Academy's private ledgers. Their dark leather binds promised the secrets they so desperately sought. He gathered several of the heaviest volumes into his arms. The weight of them felt significant, a tangible burden of proof. He whispered that they had what they needed. Verity turned from her post, her eyes wide but resolute. The successful acquisition was a small victory. The true risk was only beginning as they prepared to smuggle the evidence out. The small flame of the single candle guttered in a draught. It cast long, dancing shadows across the desk. Julian and Verity sat hunched over the heavy ledgers. Their world was reduced to that small pool of light. The silence in the isolated office was thick. It was broken only by the rustle of paper and the distant rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs. Julian traced a column of symbols with his finger, his brow furrowed. The system was complex, a mix of Greek letters and numerical sequences. He muttered about substitution ciphers. Then a pattern emerged, a specific sequence repeated next to certain names. Julian pointed it out, a grim certainty in his voice. They weren't just names, they were inventory numbers. The entries were chillingly clinical. They detailed a process labeled conditioning progress. Each student had a file tracking compliance and psychological resistance. Payments from prominent donors were meticulously logged beside these reports. The name Lord Peregrine Crestwell appeared with disturbing frequency. Verity's breath hitched. She had been cross-referencing the entries with her own mental catalogue. Her finger stopped on a specific number, 7 Alpha. The accompanying note was brief. Subject melody. Conditioning complete. Transfer initiated. The entry was dated the day before Lily Melody vanished from the infirmary. Her disappearance had been officially recorded as an elopement. Verity had never believed it. She looked up from the page, her face pale in the dim light. The abstract horror had just become a visceral crime. Her voice was a low, strained whisper. Lily. Julian followed her gaze to the entry. He saw the connection immediately. The intellectual curiosity that had driven their investigation evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, furious dread. The ledgers were not just records of corruption. They were a ledger of lives, traded and broken. He looked at Verity. He saw the fierce, pained understanding in her eyes. The Academy's virtuous facade was gone. It was stripped away to reveal a machinery of exploitation. The air in the room grew heavier. It was charged with the weight of their terrible discovery. They were no longer merely investigating a mystery. They were witnessing a crime in progress. Julian's fingers traced the embossed seal on a letter. It was tucked inside a ledger. Verity watched, her own hands hovering over a stack of correspondence. They had pulled it from a hidden compartment in the desk. The lamplight seemed to shrink, casting long shadows. He read the contents aloud in a hushed voice. It was a grim litany of falsified medical reports. Dr. Graves's precise script detailed student ailments with cold detachment. A fall down the main staircase was cited for a broken arm. A sudden fever explained a prolonged silence. Julian's voice faltered as he reached an entry for a girl named Mary. Her death was attributed to a weak constitution. The words felt hollow, a clinical lie masking a brutal truth. Verity pointed a trembling finger at a separate, thinner ledger. Its pages were filled not with words, but with architectural plans and supply lists. She traced a line item for thick wool felt, specified for wall panels. Another entry noted the procurement of iron locks and sound-dampening mortar. The entries were dated months before the Academy had even opened its doors. This was not a renovation. It was a deliberate construction. It was a blueprint for entrapment conceived from the very beginning. The horror of that premeditation settled deep in their bones. A floorboard in the hallway outside groaned under a heavy weight. The sound was unmistakable, shockingly loud in the silent manner. The single flame of their lamp was extinguished in one swift motion. They were plunged into absolute blackness. Julian's hand found Verity's arm in the dark. It was a silent signal to freeze. They stood motionless, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps outside did not continue. They simply stopped. Someone was standing just beyond the door, listening. The air grew cold with the paralyzing fear of discovery. They were trapped with the damning evidence spread out before them. An unknown presence waited in the dark. A cold, white shroud of fog clung to the cliffs of Ashenwood Academy, muffling the world and reducing the crash of the sea to a distant sigh. Inside the chapel, the gloom was even thicker, with stained glass saints peering down through a haze that muted their colors to a dull bruise. The assembled students stood like rows of pale statues, their breath misting in the frigid air. Julian Freeman felt the chill seep deeper than bone. He stood among the instructors, his gaze sweeping over the young women whose faces were etched with a shared, unspoken dread. It was a truth the official narrative could not erase. His eyes found Verity conscious. She stood perfectly still, a study in coiled tension, her intelligent eyes fixed on the proceedings with an analytical sharpness. Reverend Clemency's voice rang out, too loud for the hushed space. He spoke of a weak constitution succumbing to a fever, calling it a life cut short by God's mysterious will. His words were a polished stone laid over a gaping hole. Julian watched Dr. Graves, who stood near the altar with a clinical detachment that felt more like a verdict than a diagnosis. Mrs. Winterbourne, in the front pew, dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, her grief a hollow pantomime. A sharp whisper cut through the droning eulogy, coming from a student near Verity. The words were swallowed by the fog almost instantly, but Julian saw Verity's slight flinch. The whispered accusation that it was not a fever confirmed their darkest suspicions. This service was about containment, not mourning. The hollow ceremony concluded. As the students filed out, their silence was more damning than any outcry. A cold knot tightened in Julian's stomach. This was a sanctioned disappearance, an official lie designed to smother the truth. Their quiet observations had just escalated into a desperate need for action. Julian lingered near the back, the memory of the ledgers making a mockery of the Reverend's platitudes. Lily Melody had been reduced to a number, her fate logged as a transaction. His attention drifted from the empty words to the faces of the students, seeing the same hollow fear in their eyes. It was a shared understanding that this was not an accident. His eyes met Verity's for a fleeting moment. Her expression was a carefully schooled mask of sorrow, but the slight tightening of her jaw conveyed a silent warning. They were in a den of wolves, and the pack was stirring. It was then he felt the prickling sensation of being watched. He turned his head just enough to see the chapel's rear entrance. Silas, the head enforcer, stood framed in the doorway, his large form blocking the gray light from the hall. He was not participating. He was observing, his dark, unblinking eyes fixed directly on Julian. A cold dread seeped through Julian's veins. The intensity of that gaze was a message as clear as if it had been spoken aloud. Their whispered conversations had not gone unnoticed. Silas's presence transformed the abstract danger into something immediate and physical. The man's silence was more menacing than any shouted accusation. Julian turned back toward the front, forcing his breathing to remain even. The prayers now felt like a dirge for the living. He understood the Academy's corruption was not a passive evil, but a vigilant, predatory force that would eliminate any threat. The thin veneer of respectability had cracked, revealing the ruthless machinery beneath. He was no longer merely an investigator. He was a target. The chapel doors groaned open, releasing the congregation into the courtyard where the fog had swallowed the world. Shapes moved like ghosts through the muted gray light. Julian moved with the flow of bodies, the damp chill a physical echo of his dread. A faint brush against his hand broke his concentration. Something small and folded was pressed into his palm. He closed his fingers around it without looking. Verity was already a step ahead, her gray dress blending into the mist as she drifted away. The brief contact was a spark of solidarity in the overwhelming cold. He waited until he reached the relative cover of a leafless elm, its branches skeletal in the fog. He unfolded the scrap of paper with numb fingers. The tight, hurried script held a single, devastating line. Their movements were being watched more closely than they realized. Every cautious meeting and every shared glance had been noted. He crumpled the note in his fist. The warning was a cold splash of reality. Their investigation had felt like a secret shared between two, but it was in fact a performance for an unseen audience. Scanning the foggy courtyard, every shadow seemed to hold watching eyes. The imposing figures of Silas and another enforcer stood sentinel by the chapel doors. Their presence was a silent threat. This changed everything. Their careful, methodical plan was now a child's game. The net was drawing tight. Verity's warning necessitated a drastic shift. They could no longer afford to simply gather evidence. They had to act, and soon, with a boldness that terrified him. The familiar walls felt less like a prison and more like a trap about to spring shut. Their only path forward was a far riskier one, taken under the direct and knowing scrutiny of their enemies. The time for observation was over. A single lamp cast long, dancing shadows across the walls of Julian Freeman's quarters. The sea's relentless crash against the cliffs below seemed to echo the frantic rhythm of his own heart. He stood apart from Verity Constance, the space between them charged with the unspoken danger of her clandestine visit. Her movements were economical and silent as she unfolded a sheet of paper on his small desk. The hand-drawn map depicted secret arteries of Cliffside Manor. She explained the route through the servant passages in a hushed, urgent monotone. Her finger rested on a small, marked closet adjacent to the forbidden third-floor chambers. Julian studied the lines, but his mind was on the woman before him. The plan was a desperate gamble born from Lily Melody's death and Silas's watchful eyes. He finally voiced his fear, his words not for his own safety but for hers. Verity met his worried gaze, her own eyes reflecting the lamplight. She did not dismiss his concern but acknowledged it with a grave stillness. She insisted the danger was inherent to their purpose. Without this risk, their careful notes would remain just whispers. The corruption would continue, shielded by respectability. Her resolve was a cold, sharp thing. A profound understanding settled between them. The weight of their decision was a physical pressure. Outside, the wind moaned a lament against the window. In this silence, their partnership solidified into a shared burden, a pact sealed with a mutual acceptance of a terrible fate. Verity extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into an ink-black darkness. Her hand found his sleeve, a brief, guiding touch in the absolute void. They moved into the corridor, two shades slipping through the sleeping academy. The entrance to the servant passages was a section of wainscoting that swung aside with a whisper. The air inside was stale and cold. Verity led the way, her form a pale blur in the deep gloom. The passages were a tight warren of rough plaster and groaning timbers hidden behind the manor's elegant facade. Every sound was amplified in the tomb-like silence. The rustle of her skirt was a roar. Julian's own breathing sounded deafening. He focused on the faint shape of Verity ahead. She would press her ear to a door, her entire body still, waiting for footsteps to pass in the main halls beyond. They ascended a narrow, hidden staircase. Each creaking step was a fresh jolt of alarm. The air began to change. The dusty smell was gradually overpowered by a strange, sweet fragrance drifting down from above. It was the same incense, but here it was stronger, more cloying. It smelled of sanctity and decay. After what felt like an hour of tense progress, Verity stopped before a blank wall. Her fingers traced the seams in the wood paneling. A soft click echoed in the confined space. A section of the wall swung inward to reveal a deeper darkness. She gestured into the cramped opening. Julian slipped into the storage closet. The space was suffocatingly small, filled with the scent of mothballs and old linen. A slatted vent, high on the interior wall, offered a fragmented view into the chamber below. Even now, he could hear the low murmur of voices gathering. Verity stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the slightly less dark passage. Her expression was a stark mixture of fear and an iron will. Then, the secret door clicked shut, sealing him in utter blackness. The sound of her retreating footsteps faded into nothing. He was entombed. The darkness was a solid thing, pressing in on him. He settled against the rough wall, the boards digging into his back. He focused on the slivers of light from the vent, forcing his breathing to slow. Below, a heavy door groaned open. Footsteps, firm and authoritative, echoed on a hard floor. He recognized Mrs. Winterbourne's polished cadence first. It was answered by the dry, severe tones of Reverend Clemency. A third, more languid voice joined them. Lord Crestwell was present. The air in the chamber below began to thicken perceptibly. The strange incense now formed a visible, smoky haze drifting past his narrow viewpoint. Then he saw her. Verity entered with a group of other students, her head bowed in a perfect imitation of reverence. Her posture was one of complete submission, but Julian detected the subtle tension she carried in her shoulders. Her performance was already underway, a dangerous dance on a knife's edge. From somewhere beyond the manor walls, the crunch of carriage wheels on gravel signaled the arrival of more guests. The murmuring in the chamber fell to a hushed, anticipatory silence. Julian pressed his eye closer to the slats, his heart, a trapped bird, beating against his ribs. He was a ghost at a feast, a witness hidden in the walls, poised to see the terrible truth of Ashenwood Academy laid bare. Julian Freeman pressed himself deeper into the dark crevice of the storage closet. His knees were wedged tight against his chest. The air tasted of old linen and dust. Beneath that was something else, a cloying sweetness seeping through the rough wooden slats. A sliver of light, carefully arranged by Verity, was his only window. Through the gap, he saw the grand room choked with strange smoke from ornate braziers. It coiled in the lamplight like sluggish serpents. The faces of wealthy men stood along the walls, their fine coats and polished boots a mark of immense privilege. Julian recognized Lord Peregrine Crestwell's hawk-like profile. The man's expression held a bored, clinical interest. Then the students filed in. They moved with a synchronized lethargy, eyes downcast, steps unnaturally even. Verity was among them. Her posture was a perfect mimicry of vacant compliance. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was the terrible truth he had only suspected. Seeing it made his blood run cold. Mrs. Winterbourne presided at the head of the gathering. Her elegant black gown was a stark contrast to the grim spectacle. Dr. Graves and Reverend Clemency flanked her, their presence lending a grotesque air of legitimacy. The Reverend began a recitation. His voice dripped with a piety that felt like a violation. He used familiar scriptures, but their cadence was twisted into an oppressive litany. Julian watched as the students were led through prescribed gestures. They raised their hands in slow, uniform arcs, a mockery of prayer. He saw the way Winterbourne's eyes flicked across the donors. A silent transaction passed in the heavy air. This was no educational ceremony. It was a performance of exploitation. The ritual intensified. One by one, students were brought forward to recite from heavy, leather-bound books. Their voices were flat and monotone, stripped of all individuality. They spoke of their own unworthiness. They expressed gratitude for the harsh lessons that broke their pride. Julian felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was a systematic dismantling of the spirit. His gaze remained locked on Verity. She stood with the others, her head bowed in apparent submission. But her eyes, when they lifted for a fraction of a second, held a sharp, lucid intelligence. She performed the required gestures with a fluid grace that mimicked perfect compliance. It was a masterful act of deception. Her turn to recite arrived. She stepped forward without hesitation. Her voice mirrored the hollow tone of the others, a chillingly perfect performance. As she finished and stepped back, her hand brushed against her skirt. Her fingers curled, then extended subtly towards his hiding place. It was a fleeting gesture, a mere twitch of her index finger. It was their pre-arranged signal. A wave of relief, sharp and brief, cut through Julian's dread. She was safe. More than that, she was actively observing. This silent accord solidified their purpose. They were allies against the overwhelming darkness. Julian's attention then shifted to the observers. He studied the faces of the men lining the walls. Recognition dawned with a slow, sickening horror. He saw the portly figure of Magistrate Hawthorne, a man synonymous with local justice. Beside him stood a tall, gaunt state legislator. The conspiracy was not confined to the Academy's leadership. It reached into the very pillars of authority. The cold knot in his stomach turned to ice. Exposing the Academy would require bypassing the entire conventional legal system. There would be no appeal to the courts. The law was here, watching, complicit. The ritual reached its climax. Reverend Clemency's voice rose to a fever pitch. He exhorted the students to embrace their nothingness. The donors leaned forward slightly, their detached curiosity sharpened into something more avid. The atmosphere became charged with a palpable, dangerous energy. The ceremony concluded with a final, unison chant from the students. The donors began to murmur among themselves, a low hum of satisfaction. Mrs. Winterbourne offered them a thin, frigid smile. The students were led from the room, Verity among them. Her performance was complete. Silence descended, broken only by the soft footsteps of the departing guests. Julian remained frozen in his hiding place. The gravity of his discovery was a heavy stone in his chest. He had to wait for the coast to clear. Then a floorboard groaned in the corridor outside. The sound was soft, but to Julian it was as sharp as a pistol shot. He froze, his breath catching. He pressed himself deeper into the crevice between two cold stone shelves. The scent of dried herbs filled his nostrils. A sliver of light from the empty chamber sliced across the floor inches from his boots. Shadows moved across it, distorted and elongated. He heard the measured tread of someone walking without hurry. The footsteps paused near the storeroom door. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. He could make out the faint creak of leather and heavy fabric. This was not a servant. A cold dread seized him. He was trapped. The only way out was through that door, now blocked by one of the complicit men. A low voice spoke, very close to the door. The words were muffled, but the tone was clear. It was a question. Another voice, higher and nasal, answered with a dismissive remark. Julian caught only fragments. One voice mentioned the need for discretion. The other laughed softly, a sound devoid of any humor. The footsteps resumed, moving away down the corridor. The immediate danger had passed, but the reprieve was temporary. He remained a mouse in a house of cats. Every second increased the risk of discovery. The knowledge he carried was a death sentence, and the judges had already shown their hand. Julian held his breath, his body frozen in the cramped linen closet. Two men stood just outside the door, their conversation a terrifyingly ordinary discussion about carriage horses. Their casual tone made the evil in the next room feel even more monstrous. He waited, smelling the dust and dried herbs around him. Only when their footsteps faded did he dare to exhale. The immediate threat had passed, but the larger trap remained completely intact. He was a rat in the walls of a predator's den. He peered through the crack again. The ritual had ended, but the chamber was still occupied. Patrons mingled in small groups, their polite chatter a low hum. Mrs. Winterbourne moved among them with the polished ease of a society hostess. She exchanged quiet words with Magistrate Hawthorne, her smile a bloodless curve. The sight confirmed Julian's worst fear. The law was not an avenue for justice here. It was part of the machinery. His original plan now seemed like a childish fantasy. Reporting to the local authorities would be suicide. Any accusation would land on the desk of a conspirator. He and Verity would be silenced with the system's full sanction. This realization was a cold, heavy stone in his gut. His gaze swept the room, now actively cataloging evidence. He noted the cut of a man's coat, the crest on a woman's ring. Through the high window, he saw a carriage below, its panel marked with a distinctive hawk emblem. He burned every detail into his memory. Winterbourne's earlier offer in her study took on a sinister new clarity. She had not been offering a teaching position. She had been presenting a choice between assimilation and annihilation. To accept was to become a cog in the machine. To refuse was to be marked for elimination. His eyes found Verity. She stood near the heavy curtain, her head bowed as if in meek reflection. A matron spoke to her, and Verity nodded with convincing submission. Her performance was flawless, a testament to her courage and their shared peril. Then, as if sensing his watchfulness, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes met his across the crowded room. There was no obvious signal, but in that brief connection, he saw a reflection of his own hardened resolve. The fear was still there, but it was now subordinate to a fierce purpose. She was not broken. She was waiting. In that silent exchange, a new plan began to form. They had to bypass the corrupted power structure entirely. They had to escape Cliffside Manor and get their testimony to a higher authority, one beyond Winterbourne's reach. It was a desperate gambit, but the only one left. The risk of any communication was immense. He spotted Silas, the groundskeeper, standing watch by the main doors. The man's large, still frame was a constant reminder of the physical power enforcing the Academy's rules. Julian forced his attention away from Verity. He felt a profound shift within himself. The paralyzing horror from the ritual was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. The conspiracy scale was no longer a source of despair, but a problem to be solved. The Academy was a symptom of a deeper sickness in the world beyond these cliffs. His determination solidified into a clear, cold purpose. He would not be a victim. He would become an adversary. He and Verity were no longer just two trapped individuals. They were the beginning of a resistance. The guests began to take their leave, offering polished farewells. Julian watched each departure, memorizing faces and names murmured in parting. The chamber slowly emptied, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. Soon, Only the inner circle remained. Mrs. Winterbourne's voice cut through the remaining murmur. She spoke to Dr. Graves, her tone losing its hostess warmth. The equinox alignment is critical. There can be no further delays. Her words were a clear command, implying a timeline he did not yet understand. Dr. Graves inclined his head in agreement. The preparations will be complete. The subjects are responding admirably to the conditioning. The clinical language sent a fresh chill down Julian's spine. These were not students to them. They were subjects. Julian remained perfectly still, listening to the final movements. The soft click of a door, the fading echo of footsteps on the hardwood floor. Then, a heavy silence fell. He was alone again in the dark closet, but he was no longer the same man. He had witnessed the full truth and found his path through it. The sea wind rattled the window pane, a lonely sound that now felt like a call to arms. He knew the next move was his to make, and it had to be made tonight. Silas's grip was an unyielding pressure on Julian's arm, steering him through the pre-dawn silence of Cliffside Manor. The grandeur of the house felt stripped away in that hollow hour, leaving only a cold, watchful skeleton. Julian's heart beat a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but his mind was unnervingly clear. He had known this summons would come. They stopped before a pair of dark, polished doors. Silas knocked once, a sound that cracked the silence like a gunshot. A voice from within granted entry. The door swung open onto Mrs. Winterbourne's private office. The room was a carefully constructed stage of power. An opulent Persian rug lay underfoot, its intricate patterns a maze of deep blues and crimsons. Heavy velvet drapes, the color of a long-dried wound, were drawn against the weak morning light. Books lined the walls, their leather bindings seeming to absorb the faint illumination. The air was cold and still, smelling of old paper and a faint floral perfume. Mrs. Winterbourne sat behind a massive mahogany desk, her posture rigidly perfect. She did not look up immediately, finishing an entry in a large ledger with a slow, deliberate stroke of her pen. The scratch of the nib was the only sound. The silence stretched, a tactical weapon. Finally, she closed the book and lifted her gaze. Her expression held no anger, only a cold clinical assessment. Silas retreated to a corner, merging with the shadows. Winterbourne's voice was calm and measured. She revealed she had been aware of his investigation for weeks. She knew of his meetings with the seamstress, his searches of the records office, his every furtive step. She framed his actions not as a rebellion, but as a useful stress test for her organization's security. She remarked on his keen mind and resourceful nature, qualities she considered too valuable to waste. A cold dread, deeper than any fear of physical harm, washed over Julian. The revelation that he had been a performer on a stage she built was a profound psychological blow. His sense of agency evaporated. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes pinning him in place. She presented him with an ultimatum. He could accept a position of significant influence within her network, a life of wealth and security. The alternative was simple erasure. His name would vanish from the Academy's records. She framed it as a choice between pragmatic survival and futile martyrdom. Julian felt the weight of the decision press down on him. He attempted a final, weak protest of innocence. A faint, cold smile touched Winterbourne's lips. She understood his defiance was born of a single, foolish hope. To demonstrate the utter futility of his position, she opened a small drawer in her desk. Her movements were unhurried, theatrical. She placed a single object on the polished wood between them. It was the small signet seal. the one he had pried from a compromised donor's letter and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his quarters. It was his most carefully guarded piece of tangible evidence. The sight of it there, in her possession, shattered the last of his resolve. It was undeniable proof. Her surveillance was absolute. Her control was complete. Every secret he thought he held was already known to her. He looked from the seal to Winterbourne's impassive face, then to Silas's looming figure. The physical danger in the room became palpable. His hope evaporated, leaving behind only the stark reality of his predicament. The first harsh rays of dawn finally pierced the leaded glass, illuminating dust motes dancing like agitated spirits. The pale light felt intrusive. Julian stood his ground, the silence heavy with his unspoken refusal. Winterbourne's smile remained, a cold, sharp thing. She explained. Her mastery lay in turning the vulnerable against one another. It was an efficient tactic to ensure compliance. With theatrical calm, she revealed the source of her most intimate information. Prudence, the student whose fearful eyes he had mistaken for shared resolve, had been her informant all along. The name landed like a physical blow. A devastating rupture of trust hollowed out Julian's chest. He saw it then with chilling clarity. Prudence's sudden absences, the way she always lingered on the edges of their secret meetings. Every shared confidence had been a calculated betrayal. A profound silence filled the room, broken only by the distant cry of gulls over the cliffs. Julian's mind raced. Sir Bible whispered one path, a life of comfort bought with complicity. Principle demanded another. He thought of the faces in the ritual chamber, of Verity's determined gaze. He could not become part of the machine that crushed them. He met Winterbourne's expectant stare. His voice was quiet but firm. "I cannot accept," he said. The air in the room seemed to solidify. Winterbourne's elegant composure fractured. A flash of pure, cold fury replaced the calm mask. She did not raise her voice. She simply gave a single, sharp nod toward the door. Silas moved with unsettling speed. His large hand clamped down on Julian's shoulder, the grip like iron. There was no struggle. Julian Freeman was no longer an investigator. He was a prisoner. Silas forced him from the room. Julian's final thought was not for his own fate. It was a desperate, fleeting hope. He prayed that Verity had managed to evade detection. His own part in this was over. The fate of every soul in Cliffside Manor now hung by the thinnest of threads. The sea wind whispered against the window pane as dawn's first harsh light strained into Mrs. Winterbourne's gloomy office. Julian Freeman felt the manor's oppressive silence press upon him. Mrs. Winterbourne meticulously arranged a set of jet-black seals on her writing desk. Without looking up, she remarked that she hoped he had found the previous night's gathering illuminating. Her voice was calm, a chilling contrast to the turmoil in his chest. When she finally lifted her gaze, her eyes held a cold assessment. Julian's throat constricted. The vertigo of realization made the floor feel unstable. Every clandestine meeting had been a trivial game she allowed them to play. His investigation was not a secret, but a test he had failed. She clarified his options with detached air. He could join her organization, rewarded with influence and wealth far beyond a teacher's means. Or he could choose the alternative. She noted that students who failed to thrive at Ashenwood were often transferred to remote institutions, and they seldom wrote home. The threat was not dismissal, but erasure. Julian understood that Silas was certainly waiting beyond the heavy oak door. The only sounds were the sigh of the sea and his own frantic pulse. He thought of Verity, a final anchor for his hope. His refusal was quiet, but absolute. He would not be conscripted. Winterbourne's composure fractured for an instant. A flash of cold fury showed before the mask reset. She gave a dismissive nod toward the door. Her tone was flat and final, as she called it a pity. In that moment, a sharp crack echoed from deep within the manor. It was followed by a rising clamor of shouts and the thud of heavy boots on the main staircase. The officer's carefully constructed quiet shattered. Mrs. Winterbourne's head snapped toward the disturbance, her posture rigid. A sliver of hope pierced Julian's terror. The first true light of dawn painted the grand hall in pale streaks as Magistrate Sterling led a contingent of constables into Cliffside Manor. Their synchronized tread on marble shattered the academy's silence. Shouted commands echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The constables moved with purpose. One group headed for the chapel study. They found Reverend Clemency kneeling before his hearth, feeding pages from his private ledgers into the flames. Strong hands pulled him from his knees. His eyes held a furious, defeated glare. Another group entered the medical office. Dr. Graves was at his desk, attempting to feed documents into a small brazier. He dropped the papers in shock as the door crashed open. He sputtered protests about professional sanctity, but his clinical detachment evaporated into raw panic as cold iron manacles clicked shut around his wrists. These swift arrests resulted from a massive, meticulously compiled dossier. The sworn testimonies of Julian Freeman and Verity Constance formed its core, combined with Elara Threadwell's detailed journals from across the harbor. The sheer weight of evidence, delivered at the perfect moment, had forced the magistrate's hand. The long-standing structure of power within the academy collapsed in those chaotic minutes. The full light of the rising sun now streamed into the grand foyer. It illuminated the stern faces of Magistrate Sterling and his men. Opposite them stood Mrs. Winterbourne, her composure an icy mask. Liberated students huddled near the great doors. Julian stood protectively near them, while Verity remained slightly apart, her gaze fixed on the confrontation. Magistrate Sterling stepped forward, his voice echoing with judicial precision. He held up a leather-bound ledger and deciphered its coded entries aloud. He spoke of financial transfers and donor lists, of clinical notes on student conditioning. He described the hidden chambers and the equinox gatherings. He named the fate of Lily Melody. Each word was a chiseled blow against the academy's facade. A terrible silence fell. For a moment, Mrs. Winterbourne's face remained a beautiful, unreadable sculpture. Then a tremor passed through her. The calm in her eyes fractured, replaced by a raw fury that seemed to darken the air. Her hands clenched, knuckles white. She looked like a cornered predator, her invincibility shattered. As two constables moved to take her arms, she did not resist physically. But her head turned. Her gaze swept over the stunned staff and the watching students until it found Verity. Their eyes locked. In that silent exchange, all of Winterbourne's venom coalesced into a vow of vengeance that transcended bars and cells. The constables led her away. The great doors stood open, the sun pouring into the foyer. It should have felt like victory. But for Verity, standing in that long accusatory light, the dawn brought no warmth. The primary conspiracy was broken, yet a colder, more personal shadow had been cast. The battle was won, but the war of wills felt far from over. The silence left behind was heavier than any that had come before.